Hi guys, welcome to our channel, where today we dive into the brutal world of medieval executioners, the wild California gold rush, and the epic ancient trade routes that shaped civilization. From the isolation and stigma faced by executioners to the rush of 49ers chasing fortune and the far-flung networks of Mesopotamia, Phoenicia, the Sahara, and the Silk Road, we've got all the fascinating and often gruesome stories covered. Don't forget to subscribe for more historical deep dives. Hit the like button. If you enjoy learning about the past, and let me know in the comments which era surprised you the most. In our journey through history's darker corners, we begin with the executioner's workshop, an inheritance of steel and shadow passed down through families like a cursed heirloom. Across village lore and royal decree alike, the office of the executioner carried an unspoken rule. The position could not be sold, traded, or even filled by outsiders, but instead belonged to a bloodline. From the moment they are born, sons of executioners are bound to a fate. They cannot escape the vengeful swing of the axe, the cold whisper of the drop, and the ritual cleansing of bloodied blades. In this segment, we unpack how this grim profession became a hereditary legacy, exploring the customs edicts and twisted sense of duty that forced generations into service at the scaffold. The roots of this hereditary system reach deep into medieval legal codes and societal beliefs about purity and pollution. Executioners were considered ritually impure, their hands sullied by blood, and their very presence thought to taint holy ground. To confine this pollution, authorities decreed that the role must remain within a single family, ensuring that the perceived stain would not spread to unrelated citizens. Over centuries, this mix of superstition and pragmatism solidified into law. Only the son, or in rare cases, the daughter of an executioner, could assume the iron gloves and heavy axe. Breaking this rule was unthinkable. To violate it meant risking divine wrath, social chaos, and the loss of a crucial civic service. Society's fear and fascination with death helped cement the executioner's isolation. Villagers recoiled at the sight of the executioner's black garb and the jingling chains that announced his arrival, scattering children and closing shop shutters in dread. Church doors often barred his entry, and bans of marriage could not be read on his behalf, forcing him to stand apart even in holy ceremonies. Entire families of executioners found themselves relegated to the outskirts of town, living in hovels near gallows or pits designated for those deemed unclean. This self-perpetuating ostracism only reinforced the hereditary cycle. No outsider would voluntarily take on such an abhorrent reputation, leaving the duty squarely on the shoulders of the executioner's descendants. For the children born to these families, conceptions of freedom and choice were foreign luxuries. From infancy, boys watched their fathers maintain blades and practice the precise motions required to sever life without hesitation. Toys and lessons in gentler trades were impractical. Instead, children were taught the rituals of purification, washing axes in consecrated wine, reciting prayers for mercy on executed souls, and donning the heavy hood that masked their identity. Education beyond the basics was rare. Scholarly pursuits were seen as unnecessary or even dangerous, lest the child question or reject the path laid before him. The family home itself became a workshop of sorts, where childhood and profession merged into a single unbreakable destiny. Training to become an executioner was rigorous and highly ceremonial. Apprenticeship often began around age 12, under the watchful eye of the father or an elder in the trade. The young aspirant learned to sharpen and test the blade on blocks of wood, gauging its balance and edge, until every swing promised a swift, clean cut. Anatomy lessons were equally essential, knowing where to strike the nape of the neck for a beheading, the base of the skull for a humane death, required detailed knowledge of bones and muscle. These lessons could include dissections of condemned criminals, usually after execution, to study the wound and refine technique. Dressing the scaffold in crisp linen and hanging a red cloth banner were part of a ritual believed to ward off evil spirits and ensure the execution proceeded without mishap. Beyond technique, executioners served as quasi-officials in the judicial process. They were required to attend public readings of sentencing, handing copy of orders, and ensuring legal procedures were visibly followed. On the day of execution, they moved in solemn procession, hooded, gloved, and carrying their tools. The crowd watched in morbid anticipation as the condemned approached the scaffold. The executioner's steady presence, a grim reassurance that justice would be served. After every execution, there were rituals. The blade was placed on an altar in a small chapel outside town walls for a blessing, and the executioner joined in prayers to absolve his soul. These obligations underscore the paradox of his vocation, an agent of death bound to serve both the state and the church. Despite the rituals meant to provide absolution, the burden on the individual was immense. Diaries and court records hint at executioners who suffered nightmares hearing phantom cries long after the gallows stood empty. Some turned to alcohol or gambling to numb their guilt and anxiety, plunging their families into poverty. Letters from sympathetic bishops occasionally offered spiritual counsel, but few dared to challenge the stigma that shrouded the office. Children raised in these households learned early to steel their nerves, but adulthood did not always bring peace. The knowledge that a single miscalculation could leave a botched execution and provoke public outrage weighed heavily on every swing of the axe. As we've seen, the executioner's role was more than a job. It was a hereditary destiny forged by law, superstition, and the demands of medieval justice. Pride in precision's loyalty to the crown and devotion to religious absolution could not erase the isolation and moral weight carried through each generation. In the next chapter, we'll follow the story to a very different landscape, the Golden Hills of 1849 California, where 49ers forged new legacies of their own. But before we leave the shadow of the scaffold, pause to imagine the son born into that lineage, standing at dawn with polished blade in hand, knowing that his every breath has been claimed in some measure by history's most somber profession. As the son of an executioner steps off the threshold of his family's tiny cottage, its thatch roof sloping over the moss-choked lane, he enters a world where every footfall echoes suspicion. The bloodline that bound him to the scaffold also marked him and his kin as outcasts, cursed from cradle to grave by the superstitions and fears of their neighbors. In this chapter, we leave the echoing ring of the axe behind and walk the narrow lanes of medieval villages where executioners and their families faced a lifetime of exclusion, humiliation, and enforced solitude. From the moment a child in an executioner's household takes her first breath, the ritual of ostracism begins. No church bell heralds her birth. No priest crosses her brow with holy water. Instead, the infant is quietly named in a makeshift baptism by the light of a tallow candle in a back alley stable or a barn. Places thought unclean enough to host the sinner's seed. As news spreads, shopkeepers shutter their windows and close their doors, convinced that a soul stained by so much blood could pollute their wares and their families. Neighbors' children, once playmates for the executioner's offspring, are hastily called away their mothers, whispering warnings of contamination and curses. By school age, these children wear their stigma like a shroud. Churchyards. The social heart of medieval life remain off-limits. At Sunday services, they gather at the butt of the aisleheads, bowed beneath the low eaves, watching their peers process in through the great wooden doors, icons glinting dogs at their heels, voices lifted in hymns. The executioner's children pray from outside eyes, tracing the leaded glass windows, as if yearning for a glimpse of a world that will never fully welcome them. When the final hymn swells and parishioners spill into the courtyard with baskets of bread and ale, the executioner's family retreats to their own small courtyard, sharing scraps and listening to distant laughter that mocks their enforced solitude. Markets, too, become arenas of shame. As the executioner's wife hauls buckets of washing to the communal well, she stands apart while other women fill their buckets and greet one another. Averted gazes follow her as she crosses the dusty yard, and murmurs swirl like autumn leaves. Best keep your distance, or God help that family's souls. Her children, clutching ragged dolls, hover at her skirts, learning early that curiosity toward their plight will be met with scorn. When they reach the town square, the water maid nods stiffly, but refuses to hand over enough pails, suggesting they fetch water from a more fitting source. Forced segregation extended even to the grave. When death finally visited the executioner's kin, their coffins were carried beyond consecrated ground to unblessed soil at the village perimeter. No stone marked their passing, only a solitary wooden cross half sunken in the damp earth. Mourners dared not follow the bier too closely, fearing that the unclean might somehow reach into the living world. After the funeral rites, if such an ugly ceremony could be called, that the family returned to empty halls and the heavy silence of a hearth that would never welcome guests. This pervasive ostracism was codified in local laws and edicts. Royal justices and town councils, perhaps seeking to contain the pollution of bloodshed, issued orders that executioners and their offspring could neither own land within city walls nor hold municipal office. In some regions, entire streets bore the burden. Hangman's Row or Witch Lane became euphemisms for the families relegated there. Property along these margins was cheap, its tenants few, and the soil poor. Yet here, the executioner's family eked out a living, repairing the gallows, tending the pit on non-execution days, and enduring the winter winds that rattled shutters left ajar by fearful neighbors. Children learned the contours of this exclusion as surely as they learned to walk. In the autumn, when the harvest festival arrived, all the village children dressed in festive motley and gathered for games, tug-of-war sack races, and dances around the maypole. The executioner's children, though they stood at the fringe of the circle, were never invited to join. No hand would clasp theirs in the woven dance. Instead, they watched hearts pounding as ribbons flew overhead and laughter rang clear in the crisp air. Yet isolation did more than wound pride. It forged a peculiar solidarity within the executioner's household. Deprived of outside friendships, family members became each other's confidants. Over the crackle of the hearth fire, they spun tales of distant lands and imagined lives where identity was defined by choice, not birth. The executioner's wife taught her daughters to sew intricate tapestries depicting scenes of gallantry and grace images meant to adorn the sturdy walls of castles far beyond the stigma of Hangman's Row. The sons, beneath the stern tutelage of their father, learned to wield tools and weapons, but also shared whispered dreams of escape smuggling letters to secret allies, concealing themselves beneath cloaks and vanishing into the night. Still, the weight of communal scorn was never far. On market days, a wooden placard might appear on the cottage door, "Beware unholy." In winter, when wolves prowled the outskirts, travelers sometimes refused the hearth's warmth, preferring cold wind over the taint of executioner's hospitality. Traders spoke of secret pacts with officials. If you see a black cloak and silver axe turn your cart around, even wandering minstrels, often the most carefree spirits, would pass by without stopping, unwilling to share their fire or their tales. Religious rituals theoretically open to all became arenas of exclusion. A priest scandalized by the presence of blood on unholy hands might refuse absolution within the church walls. Executioners' families found themselves attending Mass at twilight in a nondescript chapel outside town, its plaster walls cracked and its pews splintered. The flicker of a lone candle cast long shadows across their bowed heads. Communion wafers, blessed under hurried prayer, were distributed at the door, handed over by a priest whose lips moved swiftly to consecrate the offering. Here they clutched the Eucharist in trembling fingers, praying for mercy from a God they believed loved them, even if their neighbors did not. This daily ritual of exclusion created an identity as fixed as the iron mark branded on a criminal's skin. The executioner's children grew into adults who understood without question that their birthright was both weapon and burden. They learned to speak softly, to make themselves scarce, and to greet every stranger with a practiced deference that concealed a keener watchfulness. In taverns, they lingered at the threshold, craving the warmth of ale and the comfort of company, yet never fully stepping across the line of suspicion. Even when laws softened in later centuries permitting executioners to purchase property or marry freely, the stigma proved harder to erase. Whisper networks persisted. Landlords would heal their own wounds rather than rent to a family rumored to bear blood money. Gossip traveled faster than any edict, and old fears outlived new freedoms. Families once bound to the gallows reclaimed their place among commoners only by changing names, moving to distant towns, and abandoning the craft altogether. In reflecting on this chapter of Point 2, we see how medieval communities codified fear into law, transforming executioners and their kin into perpetual outsiders. The hereditary curse explored in Point 1 did more than chain families to the spring of the axe. It shrouded them in a lifelong cloak of exclusion, altering every aspect of daily life. As we prepare to turn our thoughts westward to the fevered hills of the California gold rush, carry with you the memory of those families cast out at dawn, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that their very blood made them unfit for the communion of men. As the earliest light of dawn filters through the narrow window of the executioner's workshop, the young apprentice stands barefoot on the cold stone floor, muscles tense with anticipation. Here, in the very space where his father once claimed his first lesson in steel, the boy begins the day's ritual. A silent bow to the altar of sharpened blades, each edge an unspoken promise of precision. Having grown up shunned by villagers and barred from sanctuary, the executioner's heir discovers that mastery of the axe and the noose is not only a craft, but a means of survival, both for body and reputation. In this chapter, we explore how generations of executioners forged a rigorous training program, told in public spectacle and private discipline, ensuring that every swing of steel would be as swift as it was authoritative. From the moment his father straps the stout leather apron around his waist, the apprentice learns that execution is as much science as ceremony. Under flickering torchlight, anatomy lessons unfold on the butcher's block, repurposed for dissecting condemned rats, and eventually the bodies of those sentenced to die. Here bone and sinew become teacher, and text guiding the boy's rough hands to the precise location where a single blow severs life with minimal suffering. With each dissection, the lesson deepens. The nape of the neck hides a vulnerable junction. The base of the skull conceals the axiom of humane dispatch. Such knowledge, painfully earned, elevates the executioner above mere brute force and transforms him into an arbiter of mercy. Sharpening the blade is its own ceremony. The apprentice kneels before a shallow trough of water whetstone in hand and lays the axe head flat against the stone's wet surface. Under his father's watchful eye, he learns to listen to the whisper of metal against stone, an almost inaudible susurration that betrays the blade's true temper. Stroke by stroke, he coaxes a keen edge until the steel gleams like a raven's wing. A single nick or uneven bevel can result in a quivering strike, prolonging agony, and inviting public outrage. Thus, the ritual of sharpening becomes a lesson in patience and humility, teaching the boy that precision in his work is inseparable from honor in his duty. Once the blade is true, the apprentice must master its arc. In the yard beyond the workshop, a sturdy oak stump serves as target and teacher. With heavy practice swings, he hones his stance feet, shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent shoulders, squared and relaxed, and learns to guide the blade in a perfect parabola. Each day, he undertakes hundreds of repetitions, first slow, deliberate movements, then gradual acceleration, finally the full-force test. When a clean cut cleaves a block of wood in two, the apprentice feels a surge of accomplishment, a fleeting moment when the world seems poised on that single arc of steel. His father nods in solemn approval, reminding him that true mastery demands unyielding repetition. But technical skill alone cannot prepare an executioner for the public spectacle. On scheduled market days or after a high-profile conviction, the apprentice steps into the square, hooded and gloved alongside the veteran executioner. As villagers gather behind hastily formed barricades, the young heir is tasked with the more menial duties, carrying the iron bucket for blood, steadying the condemned, and offering a whispered prayer for mercy. From this vantage, he witnesses the crowd's tremor of anticipation, the hush that falls when the hood is drawn over the prisoner's face, the collective intake of breath before the axe descends. These moments become living lessons in ritual and crowd control, teaching the apprentice that an execution is as much theater as it is justice. In the cool aftermath of the spectacle, the boy helps his father perform the cleansing rites. Together, they carry the blade to a small makeshift altar, often a simple stone plinth beneath a gnarled yew tree at the edge of consecrated ground. There, they pour consecrated wine over the metal, reciting prayers to expiate the stain of blood. The apprentice's voice falters at first, but the ritual's gravity demands steadiness. As the wine trickles over the blade, the air shimmers with the promise of absolution, and the boy learns that his burden extends beyond the physical act of execution. He must also carry the weight of atonement. Training to be an executioner goes beyond the axe and the block. The apprentice must also learn the art of the noose, the unforgiving knot, whose tightening ends a hanging with grim efficiency. In a cramped loft above the workshop, he practices looping hemp rope around a beam and sliding the knot to test its constricting pull on a weighted sack. Timing is crucial. A knot that cinches too slowly risks prolonging suffering. Too quickly, it may break the neck before the condemned has a moment's reflection. Through these exercises, the apprentice gains a visceral understanding of timing pressure and the merciful balance between life and death. Yet the most challenging lessons are those learned in the apprentice's own heart. By his 10th year of training, the boy has witnessed dozens of deaths, and with each one he grapples with the question of agency. Does he serve the crown, the law, or a higher moral code? The village's hatred looms large, whispered curses. Overturned carts and stray stones can find their mark even on a reinforced window. To counter this hostility, the apprentice's father insists on teaching restraint. "Let the law speak through your blade," he intones. "You are the instrument, not the judge." These words become a mantra, a reminder that executioners exist to enforce society's will, not to indulge personal vengeance. In quieter moments, the apprentice studies the ledger of sentences pinned to the workshop door. Each entry lists the crime, the date, and sometimes a brief note on the condemned's final words. Here, the boy learns the human dimension of his calling: a father who stole grain to feed his starving children, a scholar who defied the church's dictates, a nobleman accused of treason. These stories remind him that each life he ends carries a weight beyond the scaffold. They plant seeds of empathy, ensuring that he approaches every execution with solemnity rather than callousness. As the apprenticeship draws to its customary decade, the boy faces a final test. His first solo execution. Under the watchful gaze of town officials and a cruelly expectant crowd, he must perform every ritual with unerring precision, from reading the warrant aloud to positioning the condemned to the single decisive swing of the axe. In that harrowing moment, years of training converge into one instant. When the blade falls cleanly and the prisoner's eyes freeze in that final blink, the apprentice feels a strange blend of triumph and sorrow. The crowd erupts in a mixture of relief and applause, and the young executioner steps back, blade trembling in his gloved hand. With mastery demonstrated, the apprentice is at last recognized as a full executioner in his own right. Yet the lessons learned within the workshop's stone walls never fade. Each morning, he still bows to the sharpened blades, still kneels before the oak stump, and still performs the ritual cleansing of blood. His work, like that of his forebears, remains both a technical exercise in precision and a solemn duty to humanity's darker laws. Having passed through the crucible of isolation and public spectacle, he carries forward not only an inherited profession, but also the weight of a family legacy, and with it, the resolve to wield justice with the utmost respect for life's final threshold. As the clang of steel on stone fades with dusk, the newly minted executioner steps through the back gate of the town walls. No greeting from the sentry, no flourish of torchlight to mark his passage. Having proven his mastery over blade and noose in the public square, he returns each night to a world that recoils at his presence. Point 3 taught him precision and ritual. Point 4 will reveal how. Despite that expertise, medieval society forces him and his kin into isolation and exile. Beyond the ramparts lies Hangman's Hollow, a narrow ribbon of land, where the town's unwanted souls dwell. Here, the executioner's hut stands alone on a patch of cracked earth, its mud brick walls stained by wind-blown ash and rain. The roof, woven of rushes, sags under winter's weight. Smoke curls from the crooked chimney, but the hearth offers little warmth against the chill of ostracism. No paths lead here, save the one he walks each dawn axe slung across his back, and each dusk the same solitary trek in reverse. The market gates slam shut at his approach. On market days, townsfolk gather in the square. Farmers hawk grain, craftsmen display wares. Children dart between stalls. But the executioner and his family must linger at the edge. Voices, hushed hands, empty. A fruit seller glances away as he extends a coin. The blacksmith's apprentice snatches his hammer back. A butcher's dog growls, low sensing in him the taste of iron and death. These small rejections accumulate until the executioner's heart feels as barren as the exile's soil beneath his feet. Water, that simple elixir of life, becomes a reminder of his pariah status. The communal well stands at the village center, its stone lip worn smooth by generations of bucket rims. Townspeople fill their pails and greet one another. Even the children squeal with delight at the cool refreshment. Yet when the executioner's wife approaches the water-maid, pauses, eyes flicking away. She dips the bucket, but keeps a firm grip on the rope, releasing just enough to wet his lips before jerking it back. Not too much, she murmurs, as though fear of contamination outweighs kindness. Religious rites offer no sanctuary. The great church doors, carved with scenes of salvation, remain closed to his family. On holy days, the congregation fills the nave, incense swirling overhead, voices raised in song. The executioner's wife and children gather outside, pressed against the buttress in a chill shadow. Through the stained glass, they glimpse angels ascending toward heaven, figures they may never join. A sympathetic priest slips to the back door, offering a wafer in hushed tones. But this secret communion cannot erase the sting of exclusion. When illness strikes, the executioner's home becomes a place of desperate vulnerability. A plague of fever sweeps through Hangman's Hollow, yet no physician passes the perimeter. Herbalists refuse their knock. Apothecaries bar the door. They fell ill in darkened rooms, husband and wife shivering under ragged blankets, children curled beside cold walls. In the absence of healers, the family turns to whispered prayers and poultices of rue and willow bark, hoping that faith alone can staunch the fever's rise. Even death grants them no dignity. When the executioner's youngest daughter succumbs to a lingering cough, her funeral procession must detour around the village green. The coffin, draped in a threadbare shroud, is carried to the western mire, a stretch of unblessed ground where no priest dares to tread. Mourners stand at a distance, backs turned, voices low. The clods of earth that cover her grave fall on her shroud with a hollow thud. There is no blessing, no choir. Only the wind's mournful sigh as it rustles the reeds above her lonely resting place. Legal statutes reinforce this banishment. Town charters decree that executioners shall dwell without gates and serve no public office, and royal edicts bar them from property ownership within city walls. Maps of the realm mark their residences in pale ink as though they exist on the margins of citizenship. Should an executioner's child reach adulthood and seek a trade outside the family craft guilds, refuse membership. Apprenticeships in blacksmithing or masonry are denied with a curt shake of the head. Your name bears too much blood. Yet within the confines of exile, the executioner's household forges its own bonds of resilience. Walls that keep them out also keep them close. At dusk, they gather around the flickering hearth, sharing scraps of stew and stolen moments of laughter. By candlelight, the executioner's wife teaches her daughters to embroider scenes of idyllic villages, imagined places where no shadow of the scaffold falls. His sons practice mock drills with wooden swords, dreaming of a day when they too might slip through the gates unrecognized. Occasionally, town officials cross the boundary to deliver warrants or collect fees. They stride into the yard atop horses shod in polished steel faces, impassive. The executioner bows his head, reaching for the leather satchel at his side. Gold coins pass between hands, clink against the stones, and the silk ribbon binding the writ flutters in the breeze. Once the papers change hands, the officials turn on their horses' heels and vanish through the gate without a backward glance. With time, the executioner learns the hidden rhythms of exile. He rises before dawn to fetch water from a roadside springs, its clear flow unclaimed by town ordinances. He forages for herbs along the hedgerows, gathering yarrow and lavender to brew calming teas. In secret, he buries a seed of hope alongside his daughter's grave, planting a small garden of memory that only his family tends. Here in the marginal land, he carves out a life defined not by townsfolk's fear, but by his own determination to endure. As centuries pass and laws soften, the outer wall grows less forbidding, but the barrier remains etched in memory. Street names change, and the word hangman fades from official records, yet mothers still lull children with warnings. Mind the old gallows road, they whisper. Travelers shrug, accepting the tale as part of folklore. The executioner's descendants, once banned by law, now buy plots within the walls, but few neighbors greet them by name. Their family history, like a scar beneath the skin, cannot be erased by ink or decree. In Point 3, our apprentice learned to wield the axe with precision. In Point 4, we witness how every swing of that axe echoes through the narrow life he leads beyond the walls. Exile and ostracism become the unseen instruments that shape his world as much as steel and rope. Though he masters the art of execution, medieval society ensures that mastery comes at the price of belonging. And so, at dawn and dusk, he walks the same lonely path, an instrument of justice, yet ever an outsider in his own land. As dusk settles over Hangman's Hollow, the executioner extinguishes the single candle by his hearth and steps into the chill of night, feeling the heavy cloak of exile drape across his shoulders. The silence here is profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through cracked shutters and the dull thud of his own heartbeat. Point 4 showed us the physical isolation forced upon him by law and fear. Now we turn inward to the spiritual and psychological crucible that turns steel-cold resolve into a simmering furnace of doubt and despair. In this chapter, we bear witness to the unseen wounds, denied sacraments, relentless guilt, and the creeping shadows of trauma that haunt the executioner long after the crowd has dispersed. Each morning he rises before sunrise and pauses at the threshold of the chapel doors, where a small wooden sign reads, "No admittance for executioner's kin." Behind stained glass windows, incense curls around holy figures, and worshippers lift voices in hymns of redemption. Yet the executioner's family lingers outside, clutching worn prayer books and watching through narrow slits as communion wafers pass from consecrated hands to pious mouths. He bows his head, heart aching, as the community's sanctuary remains firmly closed to him. Denied baptism for his youngest daughter barred from confession after a botched execution, he knows the rites meant to cleanse the soul have become tools of his exclusion. In the hush of pre-dawn, nightmares grip him by the throat. He dreams of faces he has seen only once, the condemned clutching at air, eyes wide with betrayal as the axe falls too slowly. Villagers turning on him with torches, accusing him of bloodlust rather than duty. In these dreams, the gallows become a towering forest of looming beams, each noose swinging like a pendulum over his head. He wakes in a cold sweat heart hammering, convinced he hears the silent wails of the unjustly punished echoing through his empty home. Daylight brings little relief. Shadows linger in corners, reminding him of sins committed in the name of law. Bereft of formal support, the executioner fashions his own rituals of penance. At dawn, he walks to the edge of unconsecrated ground and kneels in the dew-soaked grass, pressing his forehead to the earth, as though to plead for mercy from a God who may yet judge him. He pours water from a clay jug over his hands, repeating whispered litanies stolen from memory. Neighbors spying from a distance scoff at such spectacles, calling him mad or possessed, but he endures the insults, convinced that only through personal atonement can he hope to still the storm within. His blade, which once seemed an instrument of precise justice, now feels like an albatross around his soul. Inside his cramped quarters, his wife tends to their daughters, teaching them simple prayers with trembling lips. She too bears wounds unseen, the constant fear that a feverish cough may go untreated, because even a healer's heart recoils at her husband's reputation. Nights find her rocking the youngest child, murmuring verses from long-forgotten saints to ward off nightmares. The children, innocent of their family's history, absorb the tension in the air like damp wood. When they fall asleep, the executioner hovers at their door, staring at their serene faces, wondering if the taint of his profession will shadow their lives as it has his. On market days, he forces himself into the throng, hoping to reacquaint himself with the faces of the living rather than the dead. He buys a loaf of bread from a reluctant baker and a scrap of cheese from a hawker who tries to press a coin back into his hand. Each transaction carries a sting suspicion in furtive glances, pity in lowered eyes. He steels himself against the contempt, offering a quick nod of thanks and retreating to the outskirts to eat alone. Hunger gnaws at him, not just for food, but for human connection denied by both law and legend. In moments of utter despair, He questions the very justice he serves. If the state demands blood, is he any less culpable than the criminal? He picks up his blade, the same tool that once affirmed his skill, and runs his gloved thumb along its edge, feeling the ridges of sharpened steel. He recalls his father's admonition, "You are the instrument, not the arbiter." Yet in the gloom of his mind, the line between duty and indulgence blurs. He longs for a confessor's counsel, a friend's reassurance, but knows neither will come. His prayers echo unanswered through the vaulted sky, and his spirit quakes on the precipice of despair. Despite this darkness, the executioner clings to shards of hope. Once a month he slips a message through a crack in the chapel wall, begging for sacraments in secret. A sympathetic friar moved by compassion grants absolution in a hidden crypt beneath the abbey. There by torchlight, the executioner kneels on cold stone and hears whispered words of forgiveness like balm on raw wounds. He emerges shaken, but steadied his heart, lightened by the knowledge that grace can sometimes pierce even the thickest barriers of fear. As seasons turn, he begins to share his burden with the only people who will listen, his own family. Around the hearth, he recounts confessions in muffled tones, admits the guilt that weighs him down, and seeks their understanding rather than judgment. His wife, in turn, confesses her own terrors, and together they form a fragile circle of trust. Their daughters learn that even the most feared profession does not preclude compassion. Through shared vulnerability, the household discovers a communion deeper than any ritual imposed by a fearful town. Point 4 showed how exile shaped the executioner's world. Point 5 reveals how that isolation fractures his spirit and demands a new kind of courage. He fights battles not only on the scaffold, but within memory and faith, carving out moments of mercy in a life built on judgment. As we turn our gaze to the next chapter, where the clang of spade on earth meets the glitter of gold in California's rivers, remember the man who stands at dawn, blade at his side, soul bruised but unbroken, seeking absolution in a world that has refused him both sanctuary and solace. As the first light of dawn glimmers on the rippling waters of the American River, its surface seems almost magical. Tiny sparks of yellow dancing in the current. Centuries after executioners bowed to sharpened blades and bore the weight of souls, humanity's obsessions have shifted from administering justice to chasing glittering promises. In this chapter, we turn our gaze west to January 24, 1848, when a humble carpenter named James W. Marshall peered into that river's flow and saw something that would ignite a fever unlike any before gold. James Marshall was no stranger to hard labor or the frontier's rough edges. Born in New Jersey in 1810, he learned the trades of woodworking and milling before restless ambition drove him westward. In 1845, he arrived at John Sutter's outpost, New Helvetia, near the confluence of the Sacramento and American rivers. There, Sutter envisioned a sawmill to process timber for an agricultural empire he planned to build in the fertile Sacramento Valley. Marshall, valued for his mechanical skill, was tasked with turning that vision into reality, unaware that his greatest legacy would lie not in his craftsmanship, but in a chance encounter with fortune. By early January, the sawmill's timbers had been raised, and its water wheel began grinding under the force of diverted river flow. Each morning, Marshall and his small crew trudged through muddy banks, splitting planks and mortising beams. The rhythm was steady, almost meditative. The thunk of wood against iron, the hiss of steam boilers, the murmur of men at work. Yet beneath the routine hum, an undercurrent of possibility stirred romantic notions of untapped wealth, whispered among trappers, and traders' stories carried on the wind from distant goldfields in Georgia and North Carolina. On the crisp morning of January 24th, Marshall paused at the sluice box built alongside the mill race. He scooped a handful of gravel and water into a tin pan, swirling it in practiced arcs. Expecting the usual pebbles and sand, he instead glimpsed flecks of yellow shimmering in the pan's depths. His heart stuttered. He tilted the pan, rinsing away lighter sediments, until in his palm lay a small nugget, no larger than a pea, but glowing with promise. Marshall's breath caught as he realized the truth. This was no fool's glint, but pure gold. He cradled the fragment as if it were a living thing, its weight more substantial than any tool he had wielded. Word of Marshall's find did not remain secret for long. He hurried to John Sutter with his discovery, hoping to contain the news until Sutter could secure his land and labor for an agricultural boom. Sutter, anxious about rumors and protective of his interests, initially ordered Marshall to keep the discovery under wraps. But by March, whispers had reached San Francisco and Monterey. A few opportunistic partners defied Sutter's decree, pocketing gold samples to send to the East Coast. Newspapers published sensational headlines. Gold discovered California in the grip of fortune. Within weeks, the trickle of prospectors became a stampede. By the end of 1848, thousands of 48ers streamed into the Sierra Nevada foothills. Overland wagons groaned under supplies. Ships rerouted around Cape Horn disgorged crews hungry for riches. San Francisco's population exploded from under $1,000 in 1846 to over 25,000 by year's end. Boomtowns Coloma, Auburn, Placerville sprang up overnight, each dotted with hastily constructed tents and saloons. The landscape, once a tranquil valley of oaks and rolling hills, became a theater of pickaxes and sluice boxes. The air filled with the clang of tools and the cries of hopeful men and women staking their claims. The discovery's impact rippled far beyond personal fortunes. California's swift admission as the 31st state in September 1850 reflected its newfound political weight. Entrepreneurs like Levi Strauss and Leland Stanford seized opportunities, Strauss with durable denim for miners, Stanford with railroads linking the coast to the east. The gold rush accelerated infrastructure, telegraph lines, stagecoach routes, rail spurs, transforming the Pacific frontier into a critical node of American expansion. Yet the frenzy came at a cost. Native populations were displaced, rivers tainted by hydraulic mining, and lawlessness flourished amid the scramble for wealth. As we reflect on this pivotal moment, we see echoes of the executioner's tale. Both dramas hinge on discovery, one of human cruelty's depth, the other of the earth's hidden riches. In both, individuals respond to forces larger than themselves, the executioner bound by blood and duty, the 49er driven by greed and hope. Each swing of the axe or pickaxe reshapes not only individual lives, but entire societies. In the next chapter, we will trace how the rush for gold forged new communities, tested the limits of law and order, and sowed seeds of environmental change that resonate to this day. But for now, remember, January 24th, 1848. The day James Marshall's simple pan revealed a nugget that would alter the course of history, just as the executioner's blade once marked the boundary between life and death. Following the tremor of excitement ignited by James Marshall's golden nugget, the spring of 1849 arrived like a thunderclap across the American frontier. Trails once traversed by trappers and traders swelled into rivers of humanity. Families, fortune hunters, and the desperate alike converged upon California's rugged foothills, each drawn by the promise of instant wealth. By mid-1849, an estimated 90,000 49ers had surged into the territory, transforming sleepy settlements into bustling hubs of hope and chaos. Wagon trains spilled through the western passes in waves, their wooden wheels carving deep ruts into dusty trails. Men and women endured weeks of hardship. Cholera outbreaks at river crossings, arduous climbs over the Sierra Nevada, and the ever-present threat of bandits. Yet with each obstacle overcame the myth of easy riches grew more irresistible. Prospectors whispered of rivers glowing with gold dust, of nuggets the size of eggs waiting to be plucked from the gravel stories that spread faster than steamships could carry them to coastal ports. San Francisco, once a quiet trading post of fewer than 1,000 souls in 1846, became ground zero for this human avalanche. Dock workers scrambled to unload supplies boxes of hardtack casks of salted pork barrels of whiskey. Boarding houses sprang up overnight, cram-packed with bedraggled newcomers whose eyes gleamed with feverish anticipation. Streets that had known only dusty calm reverberated with the clip-clop of horses, the hammering of tools, and the shouted bargains of merchants eager to supply tents, pickaxes, and pans. In the city's makeshift saloons, prospectors traded rumors like currency. A man from Missouri claimed to have unearthed a mother-lode of gold near Coloma. Another swore that Sutter's Mill itself ran so rich it was like panning from the floorboards. For every triumphant show of a fist-sized nugget, dozens more bragged of empty pans and depleted claims. Yet failure seldom quashed the rush. Men simply moved on, chasing the next rumor, the next bend in the river, the next glint in the stream. Beyond San Francisco, the landscape fractured into a constellation of boomtowns. Placerville, known as Hangtown for its makeshift justice, swelled to thousands overnight, its saloons dotted with gallows, erected to enforce a rough-and-ready order. Auburn's narrow streets teemed with Chinese laborers, merchants, and immigrants from Europe, all jostling for frontage on the main thoroughfare. In Grass Valley and Nevada City, water wheels clicked and sluice boxes clattered as hydraulic mining transformed hillsides into waterfalls of mud and sediment. Yet for every durable settlement, dozens of towns flickered in and out of existence. Canvas tents and wooden shacks abandoned as quickly as they were pitched when surface gold played out. Law and order struggled to keep pace with the chaos. Elected vigilante committees seized the reins of justice, enacting summary trials for claim jumpers and thieves. Courts were cobbled together in tents or hastily erected buildings where judges and juries might be as green as the mines themselves. In Placerville, the hangman's tree stood as both symbol and instrument of frontier justice, a grim reminder that in this new world, the line between civilization and anarchy was razor-thin. Commercial enterprise boomed alongside mining. Levi Strauss, recognizing the immediate need for hardy workwear, began manufacturing durable denim trousers that would become legendary. General merchants shipped in tools, flour, and tobacco, their wagon trains stretching for miles. Entrepreneurs built sawmills, brickyards, and smelters to process the raw materials pouring out of the diggings. Every panned ounce of gold seemed to birth an entire ecosystem of commerce and infrastructure. Yet the fever of 1849 was a double-edged sword. While some prospectors struck it rich, many more toiled for months or years, only to return home empty-handed or deeply in debt. Hydraulic mining gouged scars into the Sierra foothills, sending torrents of sediment downriver to choke waterways and farmland. Native American communities already vulnerable faced renewed displacement as prospectors trespassed on ancestral lands. Rivers grew toxic with mercury used to amalgamate gold poisoning fish and tainting the lifeblood of downstream settlements. Nice. Within this maelstrom of ambition and upheaval, new social dynamics emerged. Women once scarce on the frontier carved out niches as cooks, laundresses, and boarding house keepers. Chinese immigrants, despite facing discrimination and exclusionary laws, provided essential labor digging and building. Free black prospectors and Mexican landowners who had held sway under Mexican rule found themselves navigating a shifting landscape of legal claims and racial prejudice. The gold rush, for all its promise of boundless opportunity, revealed hard truths about inequality and the human cost of rapid expansion. By the end of 1849, the shape of California had irreversibly changed. San Francisco's population had exploded to over 25,000 acres, its waterfront lined with abandoned ships repurposed into hotels and stores. The city chartered its first public services, organized fire brigades, a nascent police force, and rudimentary sanitation systems. Elsewhere, stagecoach lines carved cross-valley routes linking remote camps to supply centers. Telegraph poles marched inland, hastening news of fresh strikes and shipping schedules. The human tapestry of the 49ers, woven from the threads of ambition, desperation, and resilience, mirrored the stark contrasts of the executioner's lineage we first explored. Both stories hinge on individuals caught in forces beyond their control, the executioner bound by heredity and superstition, the prospector bound by hope and rumor. Each swing of the axe or pickaxe reshaped destinies, sometimes forging fortune, sometimes cruelty. As dawn breaks on the cusp of 1850s, the 49ers stand at a crossroads. Some will stake permanent claims, laying down roots that will evolve into enduring communities. Others will abandon their dreams and depart for new frontiers. Australia, Alaska, or back east, carrying with them tales of triumph and woe. California, once a distant territory, now pulses with possibility, its rivers coursing not only with gold, but with the promise of transformation. In the next chapter, we will explore how this rush for wealth gave way to the cementing of statehood and the rise of infrastructure, railroads, telegraphs, and institutions that bound California to the continent and to the future. But before we leave the camps and diggings, pause to envision those first tens of thousands of souls, faces hardened by sun and sweat eyes, fixed on the glittering promise beneath the water's surface, each chasing a dream that would rewrite the map of America forever. As the frenzy of 1849 reached its zenith, the glitter of dreams began to tarnish under the harsh glare of reality. Having witnessed wagon trains snake into the foothills and boomtowns spring to life, the early prospectors discovered that gold rush fortune was hard-won and often came at the price of their health, their safety, and their very sanity. In the wake of the hopeful crowds described in Point 7, we now encounter the grueling conditions that tested every ounce of grit these 49ers possessed. Dawn broke each day with the promise of discovery, but it found men already bone-tired. Before the sun cleared the ridge, miners shouldered heavy pans and pickaxes, tramping mile-long circuits along riverbanks in search of pay streaks. Their backs ached from stooping over cold stream beds. Their arms quivered with each arc of steel. The ritual of panning swirling gravel and water, letting the lighter sediments wash away, became a never-ending cycle of hope and disappointment. For every glint of gold, there were 100 pans of pebbles. By midday, calloused hands bore welts from wet leather gloves. By dusk, blisters had burst, and swollen fingers trembled from exhaustion. Such toil wore down the body, but disease preyed on the community's weakened defenses. Camps sprouted along river flats, where stagnant pools bred mosquitoes and infected water carried cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. Makeshift tents offered little protection from the elements or contagion. Miners crowded around communal cooking fires, sharing tin cups of questionable stew. One tainted ladle could seed an outbreak. Fever stole men in the night, turning hardy prospectors into trembling shadows, their bodies curled beneath patched blankets, as nurses, often fellow miners' wives, administered home remedies with shaking hands. When deaths piled up, graves were dug hastily beyond the edge of camp, marked only by overturned pickaxes, a grim monument to the price of gold. Even when illness spared them, the climate dealt its own blows. Scorching summer days burned exposed skin and turned river crossings into sun-baked trials. At high noon, heat shimmered off dusty trails, and water barrels were drained before nightfall. Come winter, snowdrifts blocked passes, and icy winds whipped through canvas shelters, chilling the marrow. Hypothermia claimed as many lives as bullets or disease. Miners huddled by smoky stoves, their breath misting in the cabins as they prayed for spring. The only reprieve was the promise of gold, yet each fluctuation in temperature reminded them how small and vulnerable they truly were. Weariness and sickness were not the only threats. Lawlessness rippled through the camps like wildfire. With no established courts or sheriffs, justice was a matter of muscle and ammunition. Claim jumpers, outsiders who brazenly staked existing claims, sparked violent confrontations at creekside diggings. Saloons doubled as ad hoc tribunals. A miner's shotgun could substitute for a jury's verdict. Hanging trees in Placerville, nicknamed Hangtown, bore silent witness to swift, often summary punishments. In the absence of formal law, vigilante committees met under the cover of darkness, stamping out perceived cheats and thieves with hasty trials and rope. Fear of retribution kept many honest, but it fueled paranoia and bloodshed in equal measure. Even inside tent city mayoralties, tension crackled. Miners shared cramped bunks and boiled common stew. A careless insult could escalate into fisticuffs or a gunfight over a bunk space. Gambling tables lured exhausted men into the wee hours where drunk wagers broke friendships as easily as they broke pockets. Brothels thrived in the chaos, offering temporary escape at exorbitant cost and sometimes becoming crucibles for disease. In these powder keg environments, camaraderie coexisted uneasily with distrust, and every handshake carried an edge of suspicion. Amid this maelstrom, the cost of living soared to almost ludicrous heights. Supplies that back east cost pennies ballooned tenfold when porterage and risk were factored in. A sack of flour that might sell for $1 in New York fetched $10 in Sacramento. Eggs commanded 50 cents apiece. Bacon was $1 per pound. Axe handles and nails disappeared from general stores as fast as they arrived on ox-drawn wagons. Merchants, few and far between, jacked prices skyward, exploiting the miners' desperation. For those who failed to strike gold, quickly selling a claim was often the only way to buy food, and even that could leave them starving. Resourceful prospectors learned to improvise. Some formed hunting parties to bag deer and rabbits, supplementing meager rations with fresh meat. Others bartered labor-building cabins, tending stock-hauling water in exchange for flour or dried beans. Makeshift gardens sprouted amid rocky soil, irrigated by trickles of river water. But these measures provided only fleeting relief. With every snowmelt and new arrival prices reset to higher levels, and the circle of scarcity tightened anew. The social fabric strained under the weight of scarcity and danger. Friends became competitors, and every man guarded his pan like a treasure. Disputes over property lines, once informal creekside markers, ignited camp-wide feuds. A miner's claim was his lifeline. Losing it could mean abandoning months of backbreaking work. In desperation, some resorted to forgery or intimidation, planting stakes overnight to usurp a neighbor's strike. These betrayals left deep scars in the fractious community, ensuring that trust was a rare commodity along the riverbanks. By nightfall, the exhausted survivors converged in scattered saloons, where the din of raucous laughter masked the deeper anxieties that lurked beneath. Miners drowned their fears in whiskey-cheering toasts of here's to striking it rich, even as they nursed wounds both physical and emotional. The barkeep counted his coins, indifferent to the sorrows behind each silver dollar. In these dimly lit rooms, tales of luck and loss merged into the fevered myths that drew even more hopeful souls westward. Those who endured months of this grind emerged hardened, but many did not emerge at all. Letters sent home chronicled body counts as casually as weather reports. Survivors' faces grew gaunt eyes, hollowed by sleepless nights and unrelenting toil. For every story of a backyard mansion built on gold, there were a dozen tales of broken bodies, shattered dreams, and families left destitute. The frontier, once romanticized as a land of boundless fortune, revealed itself as a crucible where only the relentless could endure. Yet it was these very hardships that forged the rugged culture of California's mining camps. The code of the pick and pan, never leave a fellow miner buried alive, share news of a strike respect. Another man's claim sprang from necessity. Informal hospital wards, often tents stocked with basic supplies, treated the wounded. Prayer meetings in groves of cottonwood trees offered spiritual solace. Bonds formed in adversity proved stronger than gold's fleeting sparkle. Point 7 introduced the torrent of humanity that reshaped California in 1849. Point 8 shows how that torrent battered individual lives against the jagged rocks of disease, violence, and deprivation. Exhaustion and desperation became as defining as any gold nugget, and the promise of fortune often lay just beyond reach. In the next chapter, we will see how these brutal struggles spawned yet another upheaval, one that would displace indigenous peoples and scar the environment in ways that echo to this day. But for now, pause to honor the countless souls who endured the punishing reality of the gold rush, their sweat and sorrow flowing into the rivers alongside the precious metal they so desperately sought. As the muddy waters of once clear streams lapped at the boots of weary prospectors, few paused to consider who had long called these banks home, or how the very earth beneath their feet was being torn apart. In Point 8, we witness the brutal grind of placer camps, aching backs bent over pan and pick disease, stalking dense tent cities, and claim disputes snapped lives like twigs. But as surface gold dwindled, a darker chapter unfolded, one that would not only drive indigenous communities from their ancestral lands, but also unleash environmental devastation whose scars persist to this day. By the mid-1850s, hydraulic mining arrived with the force of a siege engine. Miners rigged monitors' giant iron nozzles along steeper slopes, unleashing pressurized torrents that blasted entire hillsides into slurry. Where once stood stands of oak and willow, they found only churned mud and shattered rock. Rivers once clear enough to spot salmon ran thick and brown for miles, the muddy floodwaters choking fish and drowning downstream farms under tons of displaced sediment. Floods became commonplace as the Sacramento and its tributaries swelled, not just with winter rain, but with an unholy tide of mining debris. Fields that fed fledgling settlements were buried beneath slick layers of sludge, and towns once perched on fertile floodplains found their orchards and vegetable patches decimated. Worse still, miners relied on quicksilver to separate gold from gravel, sluicing mercury-laced sediment directly into the water. Mercury's invisible poison seeped into the soil bound to silt and flowed downstream, infiltrating ecosystems and bioaccumulating in fish and waterfowl. Nearly 2 centuries later, mercury contamination remains a blight on California's waterways, a toxic legacy unmoored from its source, but still very much alive. Meanwhile, the arrival of thousands of 49ers in once quiet valleys spelled catastrophe for Native American tribes who had lived in balance with the land for millennia. Within months of the first gold nuggets gleaming in the sun, indigenous families were driven off their hunting grounds and fishing terraces by a tide of tent shacks and pickaxes. Forests were clear-cut without ceremony, berry patches trampled underfoot, and streams once teeming with salmon now ran poisoned and muddy. Where tribal villages had raised smoke from hearth fires, prospectors built sluice boxes. Where children once learned river lore, they now encountered strangers staking claims. The brutality of this displacement knew few bounds. Some tribes were coerced into servitude, forced apprenticeships in exchange for food and pittance wages, while others fell victim to outright massacres. State-sanctioned militia campaigns, often funded by private mining interests, swept through the foothills under the pretense of pacification, killing men, women, and children, and carting off survivors to makeshift camps. In scarcely 2 decades, California's indigenous population plummeted by nearly 90%. A demographic collapse rivaled only by disease and deliberate violence. Homes that had stood for generations disappeared in the space of a season, and tribal elders watched sacred sites, rock shelters. Fishing weirs, ceremonial grounds erased by hydraulic monitors. For the miners, these grim campaigns were rarely questioned. The prevailing belief in manifest destiny cast native peoples as obstacles to progress, not human beings with rights or histories. Letters sent back east spoke only of empty hills yielding gold, never of the death toll or the ruined waterways. Yet even as the rush brought fortunes to a few, it left the landscape a battlefield of mud and blood, where the cost of gold was measured in lost cultures and poisoned earth. By the 1880s, the volume of sediment and pollution could no longer be denied. Downstream farmers whose lands lay buried beneath mudflows petitioned the courts to stop hydraulic mining. Their landmark lawsuit, Woodruff v. North Bloomfield Gravel Mining Company, culminated in an injunction that effectively banned hydraulic monitors in 1884. It was America's first major environmental ruling, yet it came too late to restore ravaged landscapes or resurrect the villages washed away by the sluices. The hills remained scarred river courses altered, and mercury locked in sediments continuing to cycle through food webs. Even as hydraulic mining waned, the damage endured. Abandoned mine tailings crumbled into gullies, fueling erosion during rains. Mercury-laden dust blew across fields, and legacy pollution in old river channels threatened water supplies. Indigenous communities, some of whom had managed to survive the worst violence, found their traditional lifeways irreversibly disrupted. Fishing, spawning grounds, lost medicinal plant habitats destroyed, and sacred sites submerged under mudflats. Yet from this tragedy emerged the earliest stirrings of environmental consciousness in America. Witnessing the slow-motion warfare wrought by hydraulic jets, naturalists and civic leaders began calling for responsibility and stewardship. Their voices rare at first planted seeds that would later bloom into the conservation movement and the establishment of national parks. But for those whose lives and legacies were buried beneath sludge, such victories rang hollow. Point 8 showed us how exhaustion and desperation crushed individual miners. Point 9 reveals how that same fever for gold extinguished entire cultures and ravaged the land. The California Gold Rush, for all its promise of opportunity, stands as a cautionary tale. When human ambition runs unchecked, it can raise not only mountains and rivers, but also the very souls of those who first called the land home. As you reflect on this chapter, remember the faces and places lost to the sluice box, and ask, at what point does progress become too costly to endure? As the last muddy sluice ponds finally drained into clearer channels, the battered camps of the gold rush slowly gave way to something new. A territory transformed by ambition, scarred by its own excess, yet poised on the brink of statehood. Point 9 showed how hydraulic monitors and fevered prospecting uprooted indigenous communities and poisoned rivers, leaving hillsides bare and ancestral villages submerged under sediment. Now, from those very upheavals emerged California's greatest legacy, its rapid transition into a free state in 1850, and the birth of infrastructure industry, and an enduring ideal, the California dream. By late 1849, the flood of 49ers had begun to stabilize. Prospectors who stayed whether by choice or necessity realized that gold alone would not sustain them forever. Towns that had erupted overnight. Coloma Grass Valley, Sacramento began to sprout permanent buildings, brick courthouses, wooden schoolhouses, frame churches. Businessmen recognized that the territory needed more than pickaxes. It needed roads, bridges, telegraph lines, and rail connections. In December 1849, delegates convened in Monterey and drafted a state constitution setting the stage for California's admission to the Union as a free state on September 9, 1850, under the Compromise of 1850. This new status not only outlawed slavery, but also gave California a full slate of federal representation, catalyzing investment in its future. The federal government, eager to bind the Pacific coast more tightly to the rest of the nation, turned its attention to transcontinental transportation. In 1862, Congress passed the Pacific Railroad Act, authorizing the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads to build a line that would link California to Illinois. For California, the promise of rails slicing through the Sierra Nevada meant that the isolation which had made mining camps so desperate would soon be a memory. Granite tunnels and wooden trestles climbed dizzying grades. Chinese laborers toiled in gnawing winter winds and summer heat, hauling tons of rock and timber to lay track. When the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit, Utah in 1869, California's ports San Francisco and San Diego were suddenly as accessible as New York Harbor, and the state's agricultural bounty and mineral wealth could flow eastward without months-long delays. Closer to the ground, stagecoach lines and wagon roads knit together inland towns that had once been islands in a sea of wilderness. Entrepreneurs like Charles Crocker and Leland Stanford, both later central figures in the Central Pacific Railroad, parlayed their mining profits into broader enterprises. Stanford used his fortune to found Leland Stanford Junior University in 1885, named in memory of his son envisioning an institution that would educate future engineers, farmers, and civic leaders. Meanwhile, mule-drawn streetcars and cable cars began to thread through San Francisco's hilly streets, heralding an urban modernity that contrasted sharply with the frontier chaos of 2 decades earlier. Amid this economic ferment, new industries blossomed. Levi Strauss, who had arrived in San Francisco in 1853 to sell dry goods to miners, recognized a need for sturdy, hard-wearing clothing. He partnered with Jacob Davis, a tailor who reinforced work pants with copper rivets, and in 1873, they patented what would become blue jeans garments that embodied both the toughness and the pioneering spirit of California. From the temperate Central Valley to the redwood-shrouded North orchards and vineyards replaced tailings piles. Oliver and William Haas planted grapevines that would grow into the wine empire of Napa Valley. Irrigation ditches and canals carried water to parched foothills, turning them into orchards of citrus olives and almonds. While railroads and agriculture remade the landscape, commerce also found banner moments on the water. Steamships churned San Francisco Bay, carrying passengers and freight to ports up and down the coast, and a thriving shipping industry connected California to Pacific markets, Hawaii, China, Japan, bringing in silk tea and spices in exchange for gold lumber and wheat. The Panama Canal, completed in 1914, later shortened voyages to the Atlantic, but even before then, the state's Pacific harbors pulsed with cosmopolitan energy. As California's economy diversified, its population continued to swell. Immigrants streamed in from around the world. Chinese laborers who had built the railroads. Filipinos drawn by agricultural jobs. Japanese farmers who pioneered new fruit and vegetable varieties. Armenian and Portuguese settlers planted vineyards and learned irrigation techniques from native communities. African Americans, both freedmen from the South and migrants from other Western states, formed vibrant communities in Oakland and Los Angeles. This multicultural influx spurred both cultural vibrancy and social tensions, setting the stage for the state's complex dance with inclusion and exclusion. The idea of the California dream took shape in this crucible of ambition and adversity. It was less about gold by then and more about reinvention, a farmer planting orchards on virgin land, a manufacturer building a canning factory on a creosote-scented slough, a professor laying the groundwork for a research university in Palo Alto. Picturing success meant more than a single strike of luck. It implied innovation, hard work, and a willingness to start anew in a land that prized opportunity above all else. By the turn of the century, California's urban centers had blossomed. Los Angeles, once a dusty pueblo of fewer than 5,000 people in 1880, exploded with the arrival of the Santa Fe Railroad in 1885 and a burgeoning oil industry. Telephone lines radiated out from its downtown, linking suburban orange groves with the boardwalk at Santa Monica. In the north, San Francisco recovered from the devastating earthquake and fire of 1906, rebuilding with wide boulevards, stately theaters, and the unique charm of its crooked hills. Electric streetlights and automobiles glided past storefronts, advertising mail-order patents, and phonograph records artifacts of a society far different from the one that had gasped for water beside a muddy creek in 1849. Education also thrived. Stanford University opened its doors in 1891, offering courses in engineering, agriculture, and liberal arts. The University of California, founded in 1868, expanded its Berkeley campus, attracting scholars and students eager to study everything from geology to philosophy. These institutions became anchors of innovation, fueling California's reputation as a crucible of technological and cultural breakthroughs. A reputation that would later bloom into Silicon Valley and Hollywood. Throughout these transformations, the memory of the gold rush lingered in folklore and architecture. Historic mining towns preserved their wooden sidewalks and saloon facades. Museums displayed sluice pans and mercury retorts. Stories of mother-lode fortunes passed from one generation to the next, and the state's motto's Eureka on its seal. Golden State, in its sobriquet, outright proclaimed the connection between the quest for gold and the promise of a richer life. Yet the darker truths of displacement and environmental ruin prompted pioneers in conservation to establish the nation's first state parks. Big Basin in 1902 and Yosemite under state control in 1864, protecting redwood groves and waterfalls from the same heedless exploitation that had once been California's hallmark. Point 9 revealed the cost of unbridled ambition, how hydraulic jets gutted rivers, and how native cultures were nearly wiped from their homelands. Point 10 shows that from those very crucibles of destruction arose a state dedicated to growth, innovation, and reinvention. California's journey from a chaotic mining frontier to a beacon of economic dynamism underscores a paradox. The same zeal that carved canyons out of hillsides also laid railbeds across mountains. The same drive that stripped land bare also planted vineyards that would endure for centuries. In this alchemy of ambition, fault, and resilience, the California dream was born a testament to both the promise and the peril of pioneering spirit. As California's iron rails rose over mountain passes and snaked into the valley floors, they echoed a far older impulse, the human drive to bridge distance for the sake of exchange. Thousands of years before the gold rush remade the American West. Prehistoric communities carved out corridors across rugged landscapes, hauling essential commodities, salt, flint, and shell, from source to settlement. In this chapter, we trace those primeval arteries of trade, where every step marked the boundary between scarcity and survival. and where the movement of goods laid the groundwork for social complexity and cultural exchange. Long before coinage or written record, salt was among humanity's most coveted resources. In regions where natural salt springs bubbled from the earth, small bands of gatherers learned to evaporate brine in clay-lined pits, producing coarse crystals that preserved meat and flavored food. Caravans of burros and dogs then carried these white nuggets along winding valleys, skirting salt deserts, and clinging to river terraces. As dawn's first light glinted off the crystalline mounds, traders would stock their sacks with salt blocks, knowing that each weight in their load could mean the difference between bounty and famine in salt-poor highland villages. These salt trails, some stretching hundreds of miles, became lifelines, sacred roads where barter and kinship intertwined. In tandem with salt flint, nature's razor traveled in the opposite direction. Quarry sites, often located in chalky outcrops or riverbeds, rang with the crack of hammers against stone as skilled knappers struck nodules into sharp-edged blades and points. These implements were essential for hunting, food preparation, and even ritual ceremonies. Flint-laden packs descended from upland quarries into forested lowlands where farmers and foragers prized them for crafting tools. Along the way, knappers exchanged broken flakes for food furs and pottery, embedding their craft within a network of mutual obligation. The paths they trod cut across ridges and followed the contours of watersheds, linking geological fortunes to human ingenuity. Shells, particularly those of marine mollusks, offered a third thread in this tapestry of exchange. On coastlines where tides left riches in their wake, gatherers harvested conch cowrie and clam shells, recognizing their durability and luster. Inland communities, far from the surf, coveted these glossy spirals as tokens of status and windows into distant worlds. Canoes laden with baskets of shell navigated estuaries and river mouths, while porters carried prized shells over mountain passes to highland plazas. Their chiefs wore necklaces of polished shell pendants, and potters in emerging villages inlaid ceramics with shell mosaics. Each shell carried the memory of the sea, a tangible reminder that even the most isolated valleys were part of a broader human lineage. Negotiating these routes demanded intimate knowledge of terrain and seasons. During rainy months, swollen rivers became highways, their currents propelling dugout canoes loaded with goods. In dry seasons, rainfall-fed springs along mountain passes guided caravans through arid basins. Traders timed departures to coincide with natural rhythms, harvests, animal migrations, even celestial events that affected both the availability of goods and the safety of passage. Campsites sprouted at reliable water sources, where stone rings held hearth fires and worn pegs marked overnight stays. Over time, these way stations grew into waypoints of exchange places where local producers met long-distance travelers, forging ties that transcended clan and dialect. The means of transport varied widely. In some regions, sturdy pack animals, donkeys, horses, and later llamas carried heavy loads of salt and flint. In others, human porters bore goods balanced atop burdensome frames. Along coastal corridors, outrigger canoes hugged shorelines, slipping through calm bays under paddle and sail. Rivers hosted rafts bound with reeds or hollowed logs, capable of floating bulky cargo downstream. Each mode of transport shaped the scale and speed of trade, determining how far and how fast a commodity could travel, and influencing the social status of those who controlled its movement. Exchange was never a purely economic act. It wove together alliances and worldviews. When a salt trader arrived at a highland village, the communal sharing of a salt-salted soup served as both transaction and treaty. Flint knappers might offer gifts of finely chipped arrowheads to local leaders, securing safe passage through territories controlled by other clans. shell beads exchanged in ceremonial contexts bound families in ties of marriage and mutual defense. These rituals transformed trade routes into conduits of culture, where language, art styles, and even religious beliefs diffused alongside material goods. The accumulation of goods in key nodes gave rise to proto-urban centers. At river confluences and mountain gateways, permanent markets emerged. There, surplus salt and exotic shells attracted thousands during seasonal fairs, fueling craft specialization and social stratification. The presence of valued commodities encouraged the development of storage facilities, granaries for dried fish, preserved with salt vaults for flint caches, and coastal points for shell stockpiles. These centers became early hubs of innovation, where metallurgical experiments and ceramic glazing techniques took root, eventually paving the way for metallurgy and writing systems. Yet the trade corridors that bound early societies were fragile, susceptible to climatic shifts and conflict. A drought could parch springs, forcing caravans to detour or perish. Tribal rivalries flared into violent raids as opponents sought to seize salt caches or flint supplies. Over time, some routes fell into disuse, abandoned when resources waned or political boundaries hardened. Still, even abandoned paths left enduring marks on the landscape, scored sandstone quarries, terraced mule tracks, and shell-rich middens that archaeologists study today to reconstruct ancient economies. Reflecting on these primordial highways of trade, we see the roots of our modern infrastructure. Just as California's railroads connected ports to interior plains, prehistoric corridors linked salt springs to hilltop villages, flint quarries to river towns, and coastlines to mountain sanctuaries. The impulse to connect to transform nature's raw bounty into shared wealth transcends millennia. In each era, humans have repurposed geography to serve society's needs, weaving networks that carry far more than cargo. They carry ideas, alliances, and the promise of a future built on collaboration. As we continue our exploration from the scaffold to the gold rush and beyond, let us remember that every road and rail line is but the latest chapter in an unbroken saga of connection that began when our ancestors first set out to trade a pinch of salt for a shard of flint. Just as prehistoric corridors carried salt flint and shell along narrow paths etched by human footsteps, so too did Mesopotamia pioneer a more sophisticated network of exchange, one that wove commodities into the very fabric of civilization and gave birth to writing itself. By 3000 BCE, the scattered barter trails of Point 11 had evolved into structured commerce between cities, kingdoms, and empires. In Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, this transformation was dramatic here. Trade demanded precision, accountability, and a new class of professional merchants empowered by ink on clay rather than spoken promise. In these fertile river valleys, urban centers like Uruk and Ur thrived on surplus grain, barley, and wheat harvested from irrigated fields. But surplus alone could not sustain growing populations, timber from the Levant, copper from Oman, tin from Iran, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan were essential imports unreachable by local artisans. To manage this vast web of inputs and outputs, priests and palace scribes devised cuneiform, one of the world's earliest writing systems. At first, stylus made wedge marks on clay tablets recorded simple tallies, how many measures of grain were received, and how many goats were exchanged. Over time, these tallies grew into detailed ledgers, tracking contracts, deliveries, and even loan agreements. The practical need to count and account for goods gave rise to the temple and palace storehouse as economic hubs. Each major city housed a complex of courtyards where farmers deposited tithes of grain and artisans contributed crafted goods. Merchants working under temple authority negotiated with caravans and riverine barges, then presented their receipts to scribes for entry into clay tablet ledgers. This system of record-keeping ensured that no shipment went unnoted and no debt went uncollected, an innovation that bound Mesopotamian society together through shared economic obligation rather than kinship alone. Along the great arteries of the Euphrates and Tigris, reed-built barges glided between cities propelled by oars or sails. In Ur, dozens of these vessels lined the wharf, their holds laden with textiles, oil, and finely wrought pottery destined for foreign markets. Overland caravans of donkeys and mules labored across desert roads and mountain passes, each beast carrying up to 100 pounds of goods. Caravan leaders depended on written contracts to define liability for lost tolls, owed at city gates, and the division of profits, early examples of risk-sharing agreements between investors and traders. As trade grew more complex, the concept of a dedicated merchant class emerged. These were not nobles or priests, but specialists in negotiation, logistics, and risk. Backed by temple or royal patronage, Mesopotamian merchants held contracts that granted them exclusive rights to certain trading routes or commodities. In turn, they provided courts with tax revenue and political alliances forged through gift-giving to foreign rulers. Merchants came to wield real influence. They financed building projects, sponsored festivals, and even negotiated peace treaties in their capacity as envoys. This institutionalization of commerce transformed exchange from a matter of necessity into a regulated system. Where prehistoric traders had depended on oral agreements and mutual trust, Mesopotamian scribes anchored commerce in clay tablet evidence. Disputes over barter now referred to written records. A palace clerk could present last month's entries to prove that 50 bushels of barley had indeed been delivered, safeguarding both buyer and seller. Justice, too, became codified. Hammurabi's law code included provisions for trade, specifying penalties for fraudulent weights or repossession of goods when debts went unpaid. Beyond grain and metals, luxury items circulated widely. Textiles woven from reed fibers or wool traveled south to Sumerian elites, while intricately carved cylinder seals accompanied high-value shipments to authenticate origin. Even beer was traded as a staple commodity, with temple accountants meticulously recording how many jugs were dispatched to support laborers on construction projects. By turning everyday consumables into line items in ledgers, Mesopotamian commerce infused daily life with the logic of accounting, making written records as vital as the goods they tracked. International exchange extended Mesopotamian influence across the Near East. From Babylon, merchants reached into Anatolia for silver, and eastward to Elam for fine textiles. Diplomatic gifts, gold ingots, exotic woods, precious stones traveled by caravan, each accompanied by dispatches carved on tablets explaining their purpose. Alliances were sealed not with marriage alone, but with material exchange backed by documented agreements. In effect, trade routes became the communication veins of empire, carrying both cargo and correspondence between distant courts. The rise of this merchant temple palace complex had lasting repercussions. It underpinned urban growth, fueling population increases that required ever more efficient food distribution. It accelerated technological innovation, standardized measurement systems, improved sailing and cart design, and developments in metallurgy, because merchants demanded better tools and faster routes. And it institutionalized the concept of credit, enabling long-time partnerships between investors and merchants that prefigured later banking practices. Moreover, the recording of trade in writing left an invaluable legacy for posterity. Archaeologists today reconstruct Mesopotamia's economic landscape by reading thousands of clay tablets detailing shipments of barley to Sippar or allocations of oil for ritual offerings. These cuneiform records illuminate not only what was traded, but who the key players were: temple administrators, caravan captains, royal investors, and how they interacted. The clay tablet thus stands as both ledger and historical document, testifying to the centrality of trade in shaping civilization's earliest chapters. Looking back, we see that Mesopotamia's pioneering of written commerce was less a break from prehistoric trade routes than its natural evolution. Point 11 described how trails of salt and flint bound tribal groups in mutual dependence. Point 12 reveals how those rudimentary pathways matured into regulated arteries of empire, where writing became the indispensable tool of exchange. The cradle of civilization thus became the cradle of commerce, demonstrating that human connection, whether through foot ox cart barge or stylus-etched tablet, remains at the heart of societal advancement. Under the watchful eyes of Mesopotamian scribes, commerce shed its oral bonds and took shape in clay tablet ledgers. Now a new power would carry trade across open water. Point 12 showed how cuneiform and river barges bound city-states through meticulous record-keeping. Point 13 takes us to the Phoenician coast, where fearless mariners transformed the Mediterranean into a marketplace of civilizations. On rocky promontories along the Levantine shore, the city-states of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos rose like beacons to sailors. Each port, though fiercely independent, shared a singular drive to send cedar plank vessels gliding over uncharted seas. Deep harbors, carved into limestone cliffs, offered safe anchorage, while markets overflowed with trade goods. Cedar beams for ship frames, jars of rare purple dye, extracted from shellfish, and ingots of copper, and tin bound for bronze workshops far inland. Phoenician shipwrights perfected hull construction with mortise and tenon joinery, wedging planks together so tightly that no rope could match its strength. By the 12th century BCE, their vessels bore enormous cargoes, hundreds of tons of timber or metal, across the restless waves. Sturdy square sails captured the spring sea breezes, while banks of oars propelled ships against calm or contrary currents. These innovations allowed Phoenician traders to venture farther than any predecessors, mapping coastlines and establishing reliable sea lanes. Navigation was part art, part science. Captains read stars and sun arcs by day and night, measured water depths with weighted leads, and memorized landmarks like hidden coves or distinctive headlands. A rising swell from a particular direction might signal an offshore reef. A flock of seabirds at dawn pointed toward land. Without formal charts, these mariners relied on oral pilot guides handed down from master to apprentice to traverse the eastern Mediterranean safely and swiftly. From their home ports, Phoenicians launched colonizing expeditions that seeded a network of trading outposts. Carthage in North Africa, Gadir on Iberia's Atlantic edge, and Kition on Cyprus. Each colony mirrored the mother city's institutions and marketplaces, serving as relay stations where goods, ideas, and cultural practices intermingled. Local artisans learned Levantine crafts, while Phoenician merchants acquired region-specific products. Olive oil from the Aegean, amber from Baltic shores, and tin from Brittany, filling holds with prized cargo for the return voyage. Yet their greatest legacy was neither timber nor metal, but the gift of letters. Seeking greater ease than complex cuneiform or hieroglyphs, Phoenician scholars distilled earlier scripts into an alphabet of 22 consonants. Each symbol represented a single sound, an ox, a house, a camel, and could be learned in days rather than years. This streamlined abjad empowered merchants and clerks to record contracts, shipping manifests, and correspondence with unprecedented clarity and speed. When Greek traders encountered this script in the 8th century BCE, they recognized its power. Adapting it to their own language, they added vowel symbols, transforming the Phoenician abjad into a true alphabet. Letters acquired names like alpha and beta, and their shapes evolved to suit Greek phonetics. Suddenly, literacy spread beyond temple and palace, fueling epic poetry, democratic debate, and public inscriptions that would define Western literary and political traditions. The Greek alphabet then traveled westward. Etruscans borrowed it for Latin Semitic peoples, modified it into Hebrew and Aramaic scripts, and from Latin sprang the alphabets of English, French, Spanish, and beyond. Across the Mediterranean, merchants tapped into this shared written code to simplify transactions. A ship docking at a Carthaginian quay could read invoices and duties penned in a familiar script, no interpreter required, unleashing a new era of economic integration. Through their ships and their letters, the Phoenicians wove together commerce and culture. Clay tablets, once confined to temple courtyards, gave way to papyrus rolls, and ink-stained parchments passed from port to port. Sailors carried not just amphorae of olive oil and jars of glass, but also alphabetic tablets that instructed foreign officials, sealed alliances, and recorded disputes. Trade routes thus became conduits of literacy, spreading alphabetic writing as surely as they carried goods. Point 12 traced how Mesopotamian clay tablets tamed trade on rivers. Point 13 shows how Phoenician mariners set that legacy free on the open sea, coupling maritime innovation with the streamlining of writing. In marrying shipbuilding with script, they laid the foundation for a truly interconnected Mediterranean world and left us the alphabet that still shapes our words today. Just as Phoenician mariners once harnessed cedar plank vessels and the newly forged alphabet to bind Mediterranean ports in a web of commerce and literacy, another great network took shape far to the south across the shifting sands of the Sahara. Point 13 traced how sea lanes and script transformed coastal trade. Point 14 carries us into the heart of the desert, where camel caravans bridged West Africa, North Africa, and the Arabian world, exchanging not only gold, salt, and incense, but also language, religion, and ideas. By the 7th century CE, the camel, dubbed the ship of the desert, had become indispensable to trans-Saharan travel. Its padded feet negotiated sun-baked dunes, and its humps stored precious fat and water, enabling journeys of weeks without a single well. Berber and Tuareg traders, masters of oases and sandstorms, organized caravans of up to 1,000 camels, each laden with sculpted salt slabs or bales of cloth. Departures were timed for cool nights when the moon's glow revealed hidden stone markers and palm-fringed springs. Under a canopy of stars, caravan leaders recited oral maps. Directions passed down through generations, guiding their charges from one mirage to the next. The routes of this desert highway reached into the kingdoms of West Africa, where gold had glittered in riverbeds for centuries. By the time Arabic geographers chronicled the region, empires like Ghana and later Mali controlled vast gold fields around Bambouk and Bouré. Yet the people of the southern forests lacked salt, a dietary necessity, and food preservative. Across the sands, salt deposits lay in Tagaza and Taoudeni, where miners harvested blocks as white as moonlight. There, every grain of desert salt equaled a flake of African gold in value. Thus began the rhythmic flow northward, went gold destined for Mediterranean and Middle Eastern markets. Southward went salt for West African courts and common tables. As caravans departed the edge of the southern Sahara, they paused at frontier towns like Sijil Massa and Walata. In these way stations, Berber merchants and sub-Saharan traders exchanged news of court intrigues, rainfall patterns, and the price of goods. Arabic scribes in these towns recorded transactions in Maghrebi script, a direct descendant of the Phoenician letters, adapted by early Islamic scholars, tying together desert commerce with earlier maritime alphabets. Here paper and palm leaf books replaced clay tablets, carrying ledgers of camel loads, and even verses of newly received Quranic teachings. Beyond commerce, religion surged along the routes. Muslim scholars from North Africa traveled to West African centers of learning, bringing the Arabic language law codes and scientific treatises. In return, West African scholars sent richly bound manuscripts filled with commentaries on jurisprudence and mathematics back northward. Mosques in Timbuktu and Gao rose from ochre brick, their minarets visible for miles across the dunes. Friday prayers echoed in surahs recited in the same tongue that Phoenician merchants once used to log amphorae in Tyre and Sidon, demonstrating the alphabet's far-flung legacy. The gold salt trade fueled the rise of West African empires. Ghana's rulers grew wealthy by taxing each caravan that crossed their territory, building palaces of carved wood and mud brick. When the Mali Empire eclipsed Ghana in the early 13th century, Mansa Musa's legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, accompanied by thousands of attendants and camels carrying gold dust, would astonish both Cairo and Constantinople, flooding markets and altering economies along the way. His caravan's inscriptions, rendered in the same cursive script, derived ultimately from Phoenician letters, bore witness to the enduring power of written exchange. But the desert was not merely a conduit for royalty. It shaped the lives of commoners as well. Women from Sahelian villages joined caravans as merchants of kola nuts and millet flour, bartering for fine cloth from Fez or ornaments from Cairo. Blacksmiths and leatherworkers traveled alongside traders, offering to repair saddles and tools in dusty encampments. Each stop at an oasis, Timbuktu Gao Agades, was a multicultural hub where Arab Berber, Songhai Hausa, and Fulani tongues mingled in the heated air. Trade routes shifted with the sands. Droughts could render one path impassable, forcing caravans to detour 100 miles east or west. Political upheaval in Maghreb or in the Sahel could close a corridor overnight. Yet flexibility and local knowledge ensured continuity. Guides marked soft spots in dunes with thorn branches. Older travelers carried talismans believed to protect against jinnish winds. Stories of miraculous oasis spring some real. Some myth sustained hope when water was scarce and caravanners sang poetry to bolster spirits on endless desert days. By the 15th century, the Portuguese arrival on the West African coast began to reroute commerce. Seaborne trade in gold and slaves gradually undercut the overland caravan traffic. Yet for centuries, the Sahara routes remained vital arteries. Architects borrowed mud brick styles from Sahelian cities for Islamic schools in Marrakesh. Sufi brotherhoods traced their lineages in genealogical scrolls exchanged across dunes. The desert spectacles of moonlit camels and wind-etched tents inspired artists and chroniclers from Andalusia to Cairo, preserving caravan lore in illuminated manuscripts. The interplay of sea and sand reflects a larger pattern in human connectivity. Phoenician ships once sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Later caravans would carry their alphabet inland, linking ocean-going scripts with desert calligraphy. The same consonantal signs that labeled cedar boards in Tyre appeared centuries later on papyrus in Cairo, then on leather bindings in Timbuktu. Through trade letters, traveled hand-to-hoof bridging languages and faiths across continents. Point 13 revealed Phoenicia's mastery of maritime commerce and the alphabet's birth. Point 14 shows how those letters and the spirit of exchange they embodied journeyed across the Sahara, carried by camel caravans that wove West Africa into the tapestry of Mediterranean and Islamic civilization. In the whisper of dunes and the clatter of camel bells, we hear echoes of ancient ships and seafarers' testaments to humanity's enduring drive to connect trade and share knowledge across the world's greatest wilderness. Just as the camel caravans of the Sahara wove gold and salt between West Africa and the Maghreb, carving living highways across empty dunes, a vast overland network sprang to life farther east, one that would come to be known as the Silk Road. Point 14 showed how desert nomads bridged continents with the ships of the desert, carrying salt blocks and gold dust beneath a sea of stars. Point 15 takes us beyond those sands into the great arteries that threaded Asia, from China's river valleys to the Mediterranean's sparkling shores, transporting not just commodities, but ideas, faiths, and technologies that would shape the fate of civilizations. Our journey begins in the fertile plains of China's Han Dynasty around the 2nd century BCE, where the imperial court coveted the finest silk from the mulberry groves of the lower Yangtze. Emperors draped themselves in shimmering gowns woven from the cocoons of thousands of silkworms, a secret so jealously guarded that death awaited any artisan who betrayed the formula. Yet the lure of profit proved stronger than imperial edict. Traders and adventurous envoys carried small silken parcels westward, disguised as simple trinkets or hidden in wooden chests alongside jade and lacquerware. Thus began the whisper of an Eastern treasure silk so fine it seemed woven from moonlight. These earliest merchants traveled in small bands, threading narrow valleys that threaded through the Tian Shan and Kunlun mountains. They relied on local guides, mountain peoples whose lives bridged agrarian valleys and highland pastures to navigate passes blanketed by snow and rock. At each caravanserai, a fortified roadside inn, they found shelter food and news of the routes ahead. Chinese bronze mirrors and lacquer bowls exchanged hands for frankincense from the Arabian Peninsula, lapis lazuli from Badakhshan, and exotic spices grown in the forests of Southeast Asia. Each transaction wove a new thread in a tapestry of exchange that stretched nearly 5,000 miles. As the network matured, several branches emerged. The northern route hugged the edge of the Gobi Desert, skirting oases like Dunhuang, where sheltering temples preserved manuscripts and supplies. Tang poet pilgrims carved Buddhist sutras on cave walls, leaving behind stone libraries that testify to the spiritual currents carried along with silk bolts and camel caravans. The southern route plunged through the Karakoram into the hot, dusty plains of India's Punjab, where Indian cotton cloth and spices met Chinese porcelain and horses. Central Asia's great trading hubs, Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv rose to prominence at these crossroads, their bazaars brimming with merchants from Tibet, Persia, and Byzantium, each speaking a different tongue, yet haggling over the same wares. Every leg of the journey bore its dangers and dramas. Bandits lay in wait among narrow defiles, knowing that a single loaded camel could fetch a king's ransom in Damascus or Constantinople. Sandstorms in the deserts could bury entire caravans in a matter of hours. Sudden spring thaws turned dusty tracks into quagmires that swallowed wheels and souls alike. To guard against these perils, traders traveled in heavily armed convoys, hiring Turkic and Mongol cavalry as escorts. In turn, those horsemen discovered that the bulging merchant caravans were not merely targets for plunder, but opportunities for profit, and so they enforced safe passage in exchange for a share of the spoils. Beyond commerce, the Silk Road functioned as the world's longest cultural thoroughfare. Buddhist monks journeyed from India to China, translating sacred texts and erecting pagodas that blended Hellenistic motifs with Indian iconography. Nestorian Christians carried scriptures in Syriac script to the Tang capital of Chang'an, establishing churches where Persian merchants gathered for prayer. Zoroastrian fire temples and Manichaean temples dotted oasis towns, their slender columns and painted murals a testament to the intermingling of beliefs. Even the earliest Muslim pilgrims trekked along these routes on their way to Mecca, spreading Islamic scholarship and technology into Central and East Asia. Technological innovations traveled in reverse as well. Papermaking, invented in the Han court, reached Samarkand by the 8th century, revolutionizing record-keeping across the Islamic world. Gunpowder formulas, smuggled by returning envoys, gradually made their way west, altering warfare in Europe centuries later. Porcelain techniques inspired local potters in Persia and Byzantium to refine their own wares, giving rise to new ceramic traditions. The Silk Road thus became a crucible for innovation, where goods and ideas mixed in caravanserai courtyard discussions and scribes translated treatises. Trade on this scale demanded more than informal agreements. It required political frameworks and alliances. The Han Dynasty dispatched envoys to forge marriage ties with nomadic courts, securing peace for merchants. Persian rulers extended subsidies and built roads. Roman emperors negotiated riverine trade rights on the Tigris and Euphrates. Under the Pax Mongolica of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire welded much of Eurasia into a single politico-military realm, guaranteeing unprecedented security for traders and travelers. During those decades, a traveler could undertake the journey from Beijing to Baghdad with the blessing of the Great Khan, exchanging letters of safe passage that carried the weight of imperial decree. Yet the Silk Road's fortunes ebbed and flowed with empire and environment. The fall of the Tang Dynasty, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the rise of maritime trade routes all diverted wealth away from overland caravans. When the Black Death swept across Eurasia in the mid-14th century, it followed these very routes carried by rats on merchant ships and fleas among packed camel caravans, demonstrating the dark side of connectedness. And yet, even as overland trade diminished coastal ports in India, and the Arabian Sea grew in importance integrating the Indian Ocean world into the same mercantile tapestry. The Silk Road's legacy endures not only in the surviving ruins of caravanserai and the faded murals of Dunhuang, but in the languages, cuisines, and beliefs of every land it touched. Kyrgyzstan's yurt-dwelling shepherds still braid felt carpets with motifs traced back to Persia. Uzbek spice markets brim with saffron and cardamom originally cultivated in India. Turkey's grand bazaars still echo with the bartering styles perfected over centuries. The very word caravan survives in dozens of languages, a living echo of those camel-led expeditions. Point 14 traced the Sahara's camel caravans blending salt and gold beneath the desert stars. Point 15 reveals that same spirit of connection writ large across the expanse of Eurasia. From the silken trails of China to the spice stalls of Constantinople, from Buddhist stupa to Zoroastrian fire temple, the Silk Road wove a rich tapestry of human endeavor. In its threads, we see how commodities can become carriers of culture, how trade can foster both innovation and ruin, and how, across mountains and sands and seas, the human impulse to connect remains as enduring as the caravans that once trudged its storied paths. From the executioner's lonely vigil to California's gold fever and the desert caravan routes of ancient empires, we've traced humanity's relentless drive to connect trade and transform the world. Though each era bore triumphs and tragedies, one truth remains: our fates are woven by the paths we forge. Which chapter surprised you most? Share in the comments whether the medieval scaffold gold rush camps or Silk Road oases captured your imagination and explain why. Your thoughts spark new perspectives and help us explore history's hidden stories together. Join the conversation below right now, and let's map our journey through time today.